This episode is brought to you by the Pelora Group.
Welcome back to Winning Through Culture.
I'm Tim Flanagan.
And I'm Amanda Kramer.
When culture's not a priority, people aren't a priority. Having an intentional focus helps you as a leader remain impactful and relevant as you move your business forward.
Welcome to Winning Through Culture.
Welcome back to another episode of Winning Through Culture. I am very excited to be here with Dr. Aaron Goodson. Dr. Goodson is currently with Duke University. You've got quite a background. I do think it's important that we share some of your bio. I will not share everything, but a really impressive background. So our session today is really going to focus on mental health, performance, and self-care, how that impacts leaders, and ultimately how leaders that attend to that part of their life create a better culture in the organizations that they lead. So let's get into a little bit about your background, Dr. Goodson, and I'm very interested with some of the things you've accomplished to hear a little bit more about it. But you are currently a mental health and performance psychology services provider for the Collegiate Athletic Administration at Duke University. So you've been in this space now for quite some time, focusing on working with student athletes on their wellness, mental health, growth, and development. You've also had a specific focus on working with Black athletes, which I think is fantastic. Your background prior to being at Duke, I think I'm a big fan of West Virginia. My son went there. So you are a graduate with your great place. He was a student manager for Bobby Huggins, which is different stories for a different time. But he definitely got a lot out of the experience. And it sounds like you did too, from getting your PhD in sports, exercise, and performance psychology to your MS in sport and exercise physiology, and then your MA in clinical mental health counseling. No, you also went to Davidson. You're a native of North Carolina, which is fantastic. Played tennis for 2 years there. And then is professionally started out in this field at Winston-Salem State University, right there up the road from Charlotte. So you got quite a background. I know you jumped into this profession 2019 at Mississippi State. And so really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Looking forward to the conversation.
I'm glad to be here, Tim. And, when you read all those things out, it helps me realize how long I've been either studying this or doing this work. And, sometimes I lose sight of that, but really thankful and blessed to have had all the experiences that I've had and just love being in the field and excited to talk a little bit about that in our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a testament to your ability to study a lot. And obviously, you've got a lot of passion for what you do to put in that kind of time, because that's anybody that's done one part of what you've accomplished understands the intensity. But when you add in MS, MA, PhD, undergrad, it's a lot of work. So congratulations. So I'm curious, though, what drew you into this field?
Yeah, I always tell folks that there are three things when I look back at my life that really drew me into the field. As you mentioned, I'm a native North Carolinian, born and raised in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And in North Carolina, when I grew up, there weren't many professional sports. And so it was very much choose your blue. And so while I'm currently working at Duke, I cannot say that I chose my Duke blue. My parents are Tar Heels, and the ties to UNC Chapel Hill run deep in my family. But the reason I bring that up is that we spent a lot of time watching collegiate sports, specifically Carolina sports, growing up. And at a really young age, even though I probably could not put into words that this was an interest in sport and exercise and performance psychology, I always wondered what happened to the people that we were watching on TV or that we were watching in the game after the game finished. And so I think that was a really, really early indication of kind of my interest in the people outside of and beyond the performance, for lack of a better term. And then you fast forward that a little bit to some of my personal sport experience. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to play a number of different sports growing up, but my two primary sports became tennis and basketball. And when you think about tennis or you think about other individual sports, those are arenas where you would more commonly hear at an earlier time this idea of mental toughness. And so I was very curious about what that was, seeking to gain a competitive advantage. And I learned quickly that different people had different definitions. Some people's definition of mental toughness was don't ever mess up, especially not in pressure situations. Some people's definitions of mental toughness was the ability to bounce back after making mistakes. Some people's definitions of mental toughness were maintain your composure and kind of be stoic and stone-faced throughout the entire thing. So I did my best at trying all three of those, and I can't even remember which one I ended up being the best at. But ultimately, all of this came to a head in my start at Davidson College. And so, as you mentioned, I had the opportunity to walk onto the tennis team and play for 2 years. And that was one of the best experiences I think I've ever had in my life. Part of what happened with that was also the ability to form an independent study course in the psychology department. And I was able to form that course in sports psychology, where I was able to learn that this was not just a concept or a topic or a thing, but it was something that people went to graduate school for and became trained professionals in. And I often tell people that once I took that independent study course and once I completed that, then the rest was history.
It's fascinating to hear your story because one thing that jumped out at me, as you said when you were younger, is your curiosity. Yeah, it's interesting how curiosity can lead us down a path. You think about that curiosity of what happens after the game led you to this place you're at now. So that's really fascinating. It's a great trait to have. I always tell people, be curious. So what is your day-to-day like at Duke now when you're working with student athletes? What's that look like?
Absolutely. So my title here at Duke is Director of Mental Health and Performance. As Director of Mental Health and Performance, I work with a team of mental health and performance providers, and we support the psychosocial development, well-being, and mental performance of Duke student athletes and teams. And so we are fortunate here to have 27 teams and about 750 student athletes. And so I say there's no such thing as a typical day. And that's one of the things that has kept me involved in college athletics and kept me involved in sports. But we do a number of different things, and each day looks like a combination of these things. So at our core, at our root, we provide individual services to Duke student athletes, exclusively to Duke student athletes. We don't work with Duke students who aren't varsity athletes. Our individual services here in our offices can treat presenting concerns across the spectrum of mental health and mental performance. So there's some student athletes that come in and they see one of our staff members and they want to talk about things related to their sport, related to their experience in their sport, whether it is their goal setting, their motivation, their resilience, their concentration, attention, things of that nature, all of those things being more on the mental performance side. But we also have the capacity and often support our individual sessions talking about just different challenges that come up in being a 17 to 23-year-old person who's at college, right? And Duke as an institution is one where there are high standards from an academic standpoint and high standards from an athletic standpoint. And so we have student athletes that will come in and they may talk about managing and navigating stress by trying to compete and maintain high standards in their athletics and their academics. We hear from student athletes that, it's maybe their first time away from home and they're navigating issues as they reflect on or still are in contact with their family of origin or from different friends or people back at home. You think about the things that are important to 17 and 23-year-old people, a lot of interpersonal dynamics, whether it is platonic relationships and friendships to, some of their first romantic relationships, or you think about their interactions with their coaches and their staff members, many of them who have known them for years before they came to Duke. So we really run the gamut of presenting concerns that we're able to support. And it's a really big part and critical part of what we do. In addition to that, we do team services. We often provide presentations to sport teams that we're assigned. And those presentations often have something to do with an aspect of mental performance. And so team sessions on motivation, on goal setting, team sessions that exist kind of throughout the season. So they kind of serve as check-ins that can be opportunities to teach different mental skills or reinforce different mental skills, talking about team dynamics, leadership, things of that nature. But I think one of the most overlooked, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, one of the most overlooked aspects of what we do is we work collaboratively with different parts of the student-athlete ecosystem. And so when I say that, we work collaboratively with our athletic trainers. We work collaboratively with our sports nutrition professionals. We work collaboratively with our strength and conditioning coaches, and then also with the sport coaches as well. And so while those individuals are not ones that come and sit in our offices and receive individual services, we often are able to have conversations with them gather collateral information. They share information with us that really help inform the way that we're not only working with and seeking to support high-performing athletes, but hoping to create, sustain healthy environments around mental health and performance, but create and sustain high-performing environments.
Yeah, when you unpack all that, that's a lot on 17 to 23-year-olds. You throw in the NIL and the portal now, and that's a tremendous amount of pressure. I'm curious as to the trends that you've seen since you've been doing this, because obviously, you got into this back in 2000 teens, and then COVID comes along, and there's just been a lot of change in our society. What have you seen trend-wise in your work, Dr. Goodson?
I've seen a couple of things trend-wise. I think the biggest thing I've seen is a more widespread acknowledgement and appreciation for mental health and mental performance support. I think that was building prior to COVID. Even though I started professionally in 2019, I was in graduate school from 2013 to 2018. I had opportunities to work with student athletes and coaches, even at that time, although in a limited capacity. And I feel like I have just seen the growth of the normalization or the acceptance that there would be a professional or a team of professionals around mental health and mental performance that are working with a high-performing team. And with that, it's been interesting to see student athletes over time that have come in with their own existing history of working with a mental health professional or a mental performance professional. And we're seeing an increase in that tremendously, so that when student athletes arrive, this is not a novel department. This is not a novel concept. I think we've also seen a rise in some of the presenting concerns, particularly around depression and anxiety. I would attribute a good portion of that to just the increased visibility that's happened over the last 5 years, not just in collegiate sport, but you think about the impact of social media, especially with young people. And you put that in combination with COVID and the forced isolation. It forced all of us to endure, but especially as I sit with clients, two things happen. One, I'm going to share in a comical way. They help me realize how old I am. And I think about, being at Mississippi State during COVID, and they tell me, what version of K through 12 they were in. That's usually something that shocks me. But the more serious component that comes with that is you think about what is critical at those ages. You think about what's critical in the middle school and the high school ages in terms of that interpersonal interaction, developing a sense of self, learning social norms, being willing to have face-to-face conversations, being willing to have tough conversations. And unfortunately, a lot of folks miss that. And you even think about the idea of, this has always been an issue, I think, but like learning how to study, right? And what was the impact of doing school virtually as a 7th grader, as a 9th grader, as an 11th grader, or even, one of the things that sticks out to me the most is last year, so not this past 2025, but 2024, I was working with clients who, and I didn't put this together until they told me, they said, Dr. Goodson, I'm kind of ashamed to say this, but I don't understand what the big deal is about graduation. I've actually never had one.
Oh, wow.
And, those seniors that graduated in May 2024 were high school seniors in 2020. And so they never experienced a high school graduation. And so as they came to college graduation and families and friends were really pushing excitement and attention, I had some that said, I just know that I'm supposed to graduate and that's a good thing, but I don't understand all the fanfare and all of the hype and all of the attention. And that really put it into perspective to me, just the impact, not just from a health perspective, but from a developmental perspective that COVID had. And so that's what I've seen in the trends over the last couple of years in student athletes.
Yeah. And that's, again, a lot for a young person to be assimilating in the midst of, to your point, the academic and athletic standards and exposure. In working with elite athletes, what have you learned about mindset, recovery, stress that might surprise people?
There are 3 things. I'll put them in order of least surprising to most surprising.
Okay.
Maybe that's a good way to do it. I think the first one that comes to mind for me is mindset is trained and rehearsed. And I think that is something that is gaining more traction. It's more popular now. So probably less surprising, but that's definitely something that elite athletes, high level and elite coaches just know and understand. and they integrate it into as many parts of their interactions and what they're doing in their training as possible. The second one is that recovery is intentional, integrated, and not optional. And so I think that is one that tends to be a little bit surprising to people because for whatever reason, when we think about the idea and the concept of recovery, it comes with this notion of you have to earn it or you have to get to a certain point before recovery is necessary. And when you think about being intentional and integrated, that's not as true, right? It is just something that we do. We don't wait until we feel something or until something is maybe not at the standard that it used to be before we say, oh, you know what? Maybe we should recover because, this is happening because we are broken down or we're not tired. And then the third one is that stress is not the enemy. And I think that's probably the most surprising. And again, comes with just some of the conceptions that we have when we hear the term and the concept of stress. We think about the idea of de-stress and we think about the idea of managing stress. And it's not as often that we talk about working in alignment with stress and utilizing and leveraging stress to help increase our concentration and attention, but to also overall help our high performance.
Mindset is a practice behavior. Recovery is a skill that needs to be intentional, and stress is not the enemy. I guess there's a level of stress that might otherwise be called anxiety that might be counterproductive, but in its true sense, stress builds strength and resilience. So, and those obviously, I think, translate nicely over to leaders in business as well, anybody that's trying to perform at a high level. When you think about the aspect of, because, there's some things you talked about, like mental health used to be kind of a taboo subject. Now there's a whole team of people at Duke and other universities that are supporting athletes. What are some of the early warning signs that you see relative to burnout?
Yeah, I think a couple that come to mind for me is losing efficiency and the time that it takes to complete a task. Something that we know should take 20 minutes, taking 30 minutes, and not entirely being sure why that is the case, right? And noticing maybe more than normal momentary lapses in attention, momentary lapses in energy. And, I think there's also something that comes with that, this idea of kind of outside of the stress, noticing more loss of enjoyment. I'd also say that recovery feeling elusive is a really good early warning sign that when you do the things that normally help you feel somewhat recharged or somewhat recovered, and those things are not resonating in the same way, or they're not generally changing the feeling that we have before we go back to the task anymore. But that can be an early warning sign of burnout. And then another that comes to mind for me, and this one sometimes is a little hard to tell because some people's personalities and dispositions, but it's just an increase in cynicism, kind of a loss of hope that can be tied to that loss of enjoyment. Just kind of noticing an increase of hoping less, thinking negatively in ways that did not exist before for that person or in that environment.
That's really interesting because, again, I'm living in the business world. I'm a really good athlete in my mind, but not in practice. But but in the business sense, so much of what you're saying I could translate into business leadership. With the high performers you do work with, Dr. Goodson, what do you see as the way they approach stress and recovery?
I think that especially with the collegiate aged folks, they are still in the process of learning the non-negotiable aspect of recovery. I think when they're performing at this high of a level, they've often been doing it as a part of their sport, and they've kind of done it because they've been told to do it. And so they see the value in it in that regard. However, for those who I have seen perform at elite levels while in college, there seems to be a bit more or a bit deeper of an understanding and acceptance of the necessity of recovery, being more than deliberate about doing it. I think about collegiate student athletes, NCAA rules, you have to have at least one off day when you're during the season and, across a 14-day window. And, with all the things that we described earlier, right? Navigating grades, navigating relationships here on campus, family relationships at home. It can be easy in that off day to kind of cut your recovery short or to feel like it's hard to squeeze in. But I found that elite athletes here that are achieving at high levels make it a non-negotiable. They have very close relationship with the trainer. They spend a lot of time in the training room. They have very high awareness of their body. And then they also kind of know what helps them recharge, whether it's being connected with our department, whether it's having a standing consultation with a sports nutrition professional, whether it's thinking about doing and engaging in a recovery lift and stretching with the strength and conditioning coach. They just know that recovery is so critical to their consistency and sustainability. And it becomes a non-negotiable in a way that sometimes it takes others a while to come to realize.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to you. I mean, I kind of come from generationally the mindset that was taught to continue to do more, and that's kind of an American societal value.
Yeah.
And I used to have a mantra, I'll just outwork everybody. I might not be the smartest guy, but I'll outwork everyone, and not necessarily the greatest model for long-term sustainability. So, how do you help people slow down and recover without feeling guilty about it? Because that's my issue, at least.
Yeah. I
A little counseling from you here, Dr. Goodson.
I think that's a great question, and honestly, it's something I worked through myself. The way I help others, and something I've also used myself, is to really, this is going to come off in a kind of silly way, but I do mean it seriously, is to ask why. But part of why I ask why is to help them understand kind of what are the beliefs behind this outworking everybody, grind all the time, no days off. And why does the idea of recovery detract from that? You can outwork everybody, work really hard, grind all the time, no days off, and still recover because you know that recovery helps you perform at the level that you desire consistently. So I often ask student athletes, where did you learn that? How have you seen that reinforced? How have you seen that backfire? And really get them curious about their own experience, but also experiences of people around them. And it's not to tell them that they're wrong, but it is a way to then leave space to insert questions about recovery in a non-negotiable way. So I will rarely tell someone to not work as hard as they are working. I will push someone to be clear on the efficiency and effectiveness of their work and to understand the recovery they engage in and whether that recovery actually feels like it aligns with them continuing to perform at a high level and if that recovery feels effective. And so that's the approach that I take, especially with a number of these student athletes across sports have professional aspirations. And so, it's easy in some ways to point at different professional athletes, especially with all the information we have access to today via the internet and social media, to hear about how they recover. And so it's like, well, if you're not doing it now, it's not a habit that you're suddenly going to develop once you get to the professional level, right? And I would even argue the same for leaders too, even though it's not as openly discussed, we are seeing an increase in that. And so if it's not something that you're doing now or that you're supporting your team in doing now, you're not going to suddenly get to the position that you hope to in leadership and then say, well, you know what we're going to start doing? I'm going to start, really being pushy about recovery and making sure it's integrated into my culture. It's highly unlikely that it'll work like that.
Well, but it is, you bring up a great point that this topic is become a accepted, embraced component of elite athletics. And I don't know that is very much the case when it comes to business. It still is more of the old school mindset, to your point of grind and outwork everybody. Yet, people being people, there's a diminishing return on that as well. And I'm curious, when you look at the things that work in athletics, because you see the comparison a lot in business to athletics or elite special forces, military people, and the mindsets and all that stuff. But what are the mindset practices or routines you see that are translatable to leadership roles in business?
Yeah, I think first to echo part of what you were stating in your question, Tim, we're seeing this increase. And I think the parallel across elite athletics, tactical populations, high risk work and business is they all require performing at a high level consistently, right? And so we are starting to see more people that are certified mental performance consultants working not just with elite athletes, but working with folks in the C-suite and businesses, working with the tactical population in the military, and working with police officers and firefighters, and then also working with people that are in the performing arts in other domains. Just this idea that high performance is for everybody. But I think, one of the practices that comes to mind for me is I often share with people, put it in writing. And I might be a little bit old school myself at saying that when I say put it in writing, I don't mean open your notes app and type it out in your notes and have it there. If that's what it takes to get started, that's great. But I think really putting a pen to paper is effective. And when I say put it in writing, I could mean journaling if we're talking about the idea of coping and reflecting. But for me, I think from a leadership standpoint, I talk about writing down reflection in some way, shape, or form. So whether you're reflecting on the training block that you've had over the last couple of days or weeks, if you're reflecting on the training that you had that day, if you're reflecting on the start of the season to where we are now, to take some time and put it in writing and to be clear on your values as they can serve as an anchor and a compass for where you are now and how you want to move forward. And I think that's true across all of those domains I mentioned where we see high performance.
Yeah, I am an ambivert, and I process a lot of things by writing them down. I'm still a paper and pencil guy. I don't like to type. And I was reflecting, doing a little check-in yesterday with myself in the morning, which is kind of my centering time and prayer time. And I realized that I had stopped journaling about 2 months ago, which I had done for years on a daily basis. And I was reflecting yesterday on how much that's actually impacted me over the last 60 days. So I went back to it this morning.
Yeah.
And that's that power of routine, power of processing and reflecting and adjusting. So,
yeah, I have a number of clients that will check in and they'll talk about something that's come up the last couple of weeks. And they'll talk about the different things that they've tried, how they're not quite understanding why this particular thing feels this stressful. And for the ones that I have worked with, I'll ask, when's the last time you wrote any of this down? And for some of them, it is an aha moment. And similar to what you shared, oh my goodness, I just realized I haven't journaled in X number of days or months, right? And so I think that is a testament to the power of journaling and writing things down for those who do engage in that practice. Now, I will say that I fully recognize in my work, I've come to understand that it is not for everybody. Yet I do think, there are different ways to journal, different formats you can journal, different ways to write and reflect, where everybody can find a way that works for them in terms of establishing a really solid routine that can either help their mindset or just kind of help their approach, or it can help them transition between tasks and things like that.
yeah. To your point, it's not for everybody, but for those of us that it is for, it's a powerful tool for sure. One of the things that obviously, Dr. Goodson, is a dynamic you deal with every day. And I think it's becoming, again, similar to mental health, a topic that people are more aware of is mental resilience, or in some cases, the lack of resilience gets maybe made more apparent than not. But what do you think are some daily practices that can help leaders, again, pulling from your athletic experience, the leaders to develop that mental resilience from a daily practice perspective?
I think, we talked a lot about journaling and just the answer to the last question. The answer to this question does not have to be by way of journaling or writing, but the practice of evaluating without judgment is top tier. And it's a skill to build and develop. Evaluating without judgment is really hard. I think we nailed the evaluation part. I think the without judgment part is the one that's a moving target for us, right? But, when I think about that from an athletic standpoint, I think about just the practice of watching film. I think about, and when I talk with coaches about, and I talk with athletes about, the natural go-to when we watch film is to see what we did not do well and to point it out so that we don't not do it well the next time we're out there. But oftentimes that also leads to an oversight of what did we do well that was effective, and holding space for that in addition to the corrections, or just what did we do as a way of kind of like seeing and establishing patterns. And I think that kind of helps build a confidence or resilience bank for people to see this is something I can do consistently, or that I do actually execute consistently. And, I think it is helpful I think it feels helpful to people if we judge as this is good or bad. However, I do think there's a real skill in being able to, engage in that evaluation and distance ourselves from judgment as much as possible to just kind of increase our self-awareness, know ourselves, know our patterns, know our responses to certain situations, interactions, conversations. And that really equips us to build that resilience to show up the same way the next day that we did the previous day.
I'm curious, what happens when judgment enters into that equation? What's kind of the cascading effect?
Well, I think to go back to something you shared at the start of this conversation, and to also pull in the well-known Ted Lasso quote, I think judgment impedes curiosity. I think the moment we start judging things, I think judgment impedes productive curiosity. That's a better way to do it, right? Because I think that if we start judging things, we judge them as bad, we don't have to impede curiosity, but we can start shaming ourselves or shaming others. Why would you do that? Why do you do that? Where did you learn that from? Right. So it doesn't impede curiosity that way, but that's just not productive curiosity. But I think,
well, it takes you out of yourself and starts putting the blame on others.
Right. But I think that's what happens when judgment enters that evaluation, because if we even take it on the other side of things, right? Well, if I evaluate this as something that we did really well or do really well consistently, it's ironic I'm going to say this, but it's one of my favorite phrases. We can fall to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And like that works until it doesn't, right? But it also keeps us
until it breaks.
Right. It keeps us from being curious about different ways to navigate and approach and address situations, conversations, people, things of that nature. And so, when judgment comes in, whether we judge something as good or we judge something as bad, I think it really inhibits our process of being curious and staying curious.
Yeah, there's a book that I read a couple of years ago by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy called The Gap in the Game. And the basic premise is that a lot of people live in the gap, which is the dissatisfaction with where they think they should be versus where they are. And their hypothesis is live in the gain, which is measure your progress, because your ideal of wherever you're trying to get to is always going to be moving up if you're a high performer. So, if you measure that deficiency, if you will, you're going to live in frustration and angst versus measuring the progress and celebrating that and then setting your sights on the next level of progress. And as you say that, it kind of strikes me that that's a similar concept in how people, in essence, show up. And I do think that, and I like the way you said that, productive curiosity can be very helpful. As we're having this conversation, I lead a team of individuals who work real hard every day and work to perform at a high level. And in our profession, that's kind of, I guess, in every business profession today, that's kind of what we're called to do. And so I am curious, how would you recommend leaders both create space for mental and emotional recovery in those types of roles? And then what kind of systems might be built into helping sustainable performance continue?
Yeah, I think my initial answer that comes to mind is super basic and maybe too basic, but for how can leaders create that space, be sure to actually create it.
Yeah. Be intentional about it. Call it what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it can feel elusive sometimes. It can feel elusive in high stress times, especially in high stress times. But just the idea of we are going to take this time to do this thing, right? Or we or I, right? So the leader themselves or say our company, we're going to take this time to do this thing, right? And, I think a lot of times people fall into the trap of, a mental and emotional recovery is going to come from free time. So if I just give you free time, then you're going to do it. And that's not a guarantee.
Not when they have families and other commitments. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's, goes back to the create it. And like you said, be intentional, deliberate, name it for what it is. And then have a practice or something that really does facilitate that genuine mental or emotional recovery. And I think from an accountability systems, a care structure standpoint, I would often ask, or I ask coaches sometimes, so how is that integrated into what exists, right? It goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. Are we waiting until a certain time to start to think about when we do these things, or is it something that we know naturally exists, or we make sure naturally exists in our environment? Because I think when done properly, care structures and accountability systems make the difference between high performers, high performing teams, and their outcomes. And so, yeah, not waiting until performance drops or lags or drags behind, but being sure to be intentional about how that's integrated, when that's integrated. There are obviously going to be times where that's compromised, but you don't throw it to the wayside. You maybe just do a little bit less of it, or you do it shorter. But I think that sends a message to teams.
Yeah, and that intentionality.
About intentionality. And it also, in some ways, I think where I've seen myself come into this, is it forces those who are on the team who might be like, well, I don't understand why we're doing this. And then there are others around them that are actually recovering to say, okay, well, what is it about me that's not recovering in this space? Like, can I talk to somebody and help figure out why I might be falling short in this idea of recovering, or if I feel like this doesn't make a difference, but my leader is saying, this is what makes the difference between us getting this result and us getting a higher result.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always say there are no coincidences. My business partner and I were having a conversation this morning before this, and it was not a planned conversation. She gave me a call to talk about a few things on her mind. And this topic, in essence, came up relative to both us as leaders and the rest of our team. So if my team hears this, by the time they hear this podcast, they will know that we are going to be taking some intentional steps in this area, because it struck me as I was listening to, I'm like, oh, well, we need to be a little more intentional about this. So, with that, I'm curious, what advice would you give leaders to model the healthy behaviors without feeling like they need to be perfect at it?
Yeah, the two things that come to mind for me are make an attempt and own your mistakes.
Yep.
And so make an attempt at the healthy behaviors for teams, at carving time out and being intentional. And if we realize that it doesn't quite hit the mark, or we realize that people may have exploited it, or it ultimately just did not lead us to where we wanted to be, to also be able to own that. This was my attempt. This was the intent. We landed away from it. I'll own that. However, this is still important, so we are going to continue to try.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I wonder, as we were having this conversation, again, a little bit of self-reflection, that my grind mentality eventually rubs off on people. And that's not so good either. So modeling a little bit less of that might be a good way to go. Are there things, in a general sense, Dr. Goodson, that you think, entrepreneurs, business owners, leaders that are listening to this podcast can do inside their own companies to really just support mental wellness at all levels?
Yeah, I think, so much what I do in my work, what sports psychology professionals do in their work, is relational.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a takeaway here of get to know your people. And I know that's going to resonate differently for someone who's leading in a company of 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people versus someone who's leading a team of 4 or 5. But it does make a difference, right? Because what might feel like recovery and wellness to you may feel like the opposite to someone on your team or to some portion of your team. And that's not to say find out what's good for everybody and then work to please everybody. But I think the more you get to know your people, the more that you can determine what is effective or what can be effective. Because sometimes people will share with you, or you'll learn about them. Okay, what is, wellness and recovery to you guys? Well, we just can't do that here. We just can't take a week off. That's just not an option for us, right?
Take every other week off.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know that you feel that way, but that's not what we can do here. All right. Let's think about what that can look like, right? Or there are things like that come to mind for me. But I do think just kind of getting to know your people, I think being deliberate about the people that you do get to know and how and why you get to know them can be critical to inform the way that you would integrate some healthy behaviors and practices into your culture that are geared towards high performance and wellness.
Okay. That's good. Curious, anything you're working on right now in your own health you're focused on?
Yes. I am focused a lot on my physical wellness right now. I think just the dynamic of aging, I will say, is one that I think gets talked about in certain like spots and at certain times, right? People kind of like talk about it in decades. When you get in your 30s, this. When you get in your 40s, this. And they don't talk about the time like between your 30s and your 40s. And so I think for me, especially being around these elite level high performers in the collegiate space and talking them through things from a mental health and wellness and mental performance standpoint, but then also working alongside, sports nutrition, athletic trainers, et cetera, it's got me really reflective because while I know I'm never going to be in the space physically to be an elite college or professional athlete again, I do know that there are things that I'm feeling and I'm noticing that I would not classify as, hey, I'm in the wellness category in these areas. And so that's something I'm really been reflecting on a lot and trying to take steps to address. And I'm hoping that it'll take off soon.
Wow. I appreciate you sharing. I mean, I think that intentionality is huge. And it's been something I've been focused on for 8 years now, just watching some of my friends start to fall apart. So
yeah, sometimes that's what it takes.
Headed down this path. I need to get myself together here quickly or I'll be falling apart too before too long. So
yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that's what it takes, but
yeah,
100% right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always say failure is a much better teacher than success.
Touche.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, Dr. Goodson, this has been a rich conversation. I really appreciate time. I mean, is there any one thing you hope people kind of take away from our time together today?
And there is. And I think it's kind of an attempt to weave everything we've talked about together. And maybe using terms I haven't used yet, but just in everything we've discussed, the concept of increased awareness begets increased responsibility is what sticks out to me, right? And what does it look like for us to increase that awareness about ourselves when it comes to wellness and recovery, but then also increase that awareness about our team and what we know about our team, or how do we empower and support others to increase that awareness about themselves? And once you have the information, that's half the battle. Then you have this increased responsibility. So what do you do with that? What are you putting into practice? What are you being deliberate about? How are you reinforcing those things? And so, yeah, increased awareness begets increased responsibility is what sticks out to me, and I hope sticks out to listeners of our conversations.
Well, I think the time we've invested here, for those that have joined us, there's a high level of new awarenesses, a few really important topics, not the least of which is, mental well-being, mental health, and ultimately how that translates into physical health and how leaders can perform at an elite level. Because as you said earlier, everybody, regardless of their area of focus, is trying to perform at a high level. And these athletes that you're working with today, those 750 athletes, some will go to professional sports, some will not, but all of them will eventually not be in sports full time, and they're going to be in other endeavors. And the skills you're helping them acquire today and the mental frameworks are going to help them perform at a high level for the rest of their life. So that's pretty impactful legacy you got going there, Dr. Goodson.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being with us. This is another great episode of Winning Through Culture here with Dr. Aaron Goodson from Duke Mental Health and Performance. And until we are together next time, think about a few things you're going to do to take care of your own wellness and the wellness of the people that you lead.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Winning Through Culture.
Until next time, stay intentional, be impactful,
because your culture matters.